Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. So, this episode is going to be a little bit different from a lot of the other ones that I've done. I am not going to focus on a particular time period or ask a big overall question about that time period or about some particular issue to have y'all consider. I am instead going to talk at length about two of the most impactful, important founding fathers in our nation's history, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. And it's kind of funny that I have wanted to do this episode for a while because just in the past few months, I have noticed more and more people in the political commentariat, in politics itself, among historians, what have you. It just seems that this conversation about the Hamiltonian approach to government and the Jeffersonian approach to government and how they differ and which is the better option of the two, if that is even how whoever's talking about it is evaluating things, it's been out there a lot lately. It's entirely possible that it's one of these things where I've just been thinking about this, so I'm noticing it, and it was always kind of there, and I just didn't notice it before, but I don't think that's the case, because I've been pretty tuned in to what the political discussions of the country have been for a long, long time, for most of my adult life, and this is not something I remember seeing before now. I got the idea initially to do this when I was putting together the episodes for the U.S. Constitution, and when I wrote the episodes about the Washington administration, which both Hamilton and Jefferson have very big roles in, Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury, Jefferson as the Secretary of State, I knew for certain that this was something that I wanted to do. I've known for a long time that I was definitely more sympathetic to Hamilton's views on government, society, and human nature than those held by Thomas Jefferson. I believe in the necessity of a strong central government for the United States and really for any large, complicated society or state all over the world, for that matter. That was what Hamilton advocated, and that is what I see as both most beneficial and, frankly, necessary to a lot of what we consider the niceties of modern existence. I think it's a necessity because government is both what stands between the worst people acquiring power to use however they would want to, very often to abuse the rest of us, and because government helps individuals and communities accomplish the things, whether it's infrastructure or military defense or technological innovation or healthcare on a very large scale or what have you, that it would be very difficult or impossible for individuals or smaller communities to accomplish on their own. I also don't share Jefferson's naive, in my view, belief in common people and individuals to do the right thing more often than not. All of us are capable of really bad behavior sometimes, and some of us are capable of truly reprehensible things much of the time. As I've learned even more in the last few months, Jefferson wasn't able to see or accept this darker side of human behavior, perhaps because he could never see or reckon with his own shortcomings as a person. But I'll get into that in a bit. I also don't share Jefferson's paranoia about powerful institutions, though I do absolutely accept the importance of reining in powerful people and institutions with checks and balances and protecting citizens against the potential excesses of their governments. I don't think that strong, wealthy governments capable of doing a lot of things for their citizens are inherently or fatally corrupt, as Jefferson did. There are things that I admire about both men, and things that kind of drive me crazy about both of them. I think it's impossible to have a greatly impactful life that betters the existence of generations of people and not have some pretty serious black marks on your legacy. In my mind, it's always a question of intent versus execution, and whether you're able to know yourself well enough to see your flaws and attempt to mitigate them. Both Jefferson and Hamilton had a lot of trouble with that last bit. But as you will see, I am much more comfortable with Hamilton's flaws than with Jefferson's flaws, which I will try my best to explain. Each man deserves his place in history, regardless of all the bad things I'm about to say about both of them. I'm going to start off with the good stuff because, as my grandfather repeatedly told me, when you're about to have a difficult conversation with someone, it's always best to start with whatever positives you can. It makes swallowing the nasty stuff a little less unpleasant. So without further ado, here we go. This is from John Meacham's, I would call it, very flattering biography of Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. Quote, "He was the father of the ideal of individual liberty, of the Louisiana Purchase, of the Lewis and Clark expedition, of the American West. He led the first democratic movement in the new republic to check the power and influence of established forces. And perhaps most important, he gave the nation the idea of American progress, the animating spirit that the future could be better than the present or the past." And this is where I want to say, for the sources that I'm using, I will be referring back to John Meacham's Art of Power. I'm going to be using extensively Ron Chernow's Alexander Hamilton biography, just called Hamilton. It's the basis for the musical, if you've seen that. That's what Lin-Manuel Miranda leaned on. I'm going to be using information that I got from The Glorious Cause, the first book that I used in the Oxford History of the United States series. I'm also going to be using information from Empire of Liberty, the other book, the one I've been using more recently in the Oxford History of the United States series. And I'm going to be taking bits and pieces from other books that I've read and used, like Plain Honest Men, the book about the making of the Constitution, Miracle at Philadelphia, that's another one that's about the making of the Constitution, and some other sources that I've used over the course of putting together these episodes. If you'd like to look at them, you can always drop in and look at the previous episodes. I always list what I'm using for each one as I do it, so they're all there. And pretty much everything I'm using comes from those. Also, from the American Pageant and Give Me Liberty and some other books I've read over the course of the 20 plus years that I've taught U.S. history. So that's where this information is coming from. So Jefferson, the very positive things you could say about him, and there are a lot of them. He was cordial, polite, and charming almost always. And even when he encountered people that he vehemently disagreed with, he did not turn off the charm and did not become aggressive or rude or confrontational. He was genuinely curious and kind-hearted, and wanted to make the world a better place than the one into which he was born. He was always thinking about how he could make America and the world better for future generations. He was interested in just about everything throughout most of his life and was what we today might call a polymath. He took on planning and raising money for infrastructure projects. He developed and invented items to make doing his work easier. For example, he invented a polygraph, something that wrote multiple copies of documents so that he wouldn't have to just write the same thing over and over again. There's a photo of it, I think maybe even a model of it at Monticello still today. He took a great interest in farming and agriculture. He was a farmer, a planter after all, in the Virginia planter tradition. He designed many of the structures at his home at Monticello and at the University of Virginia, so he was something of an amateur architect, maybe even a little bit more than just an amateur architect. And of course, he was a lawyer and a politician and was very enthusiastically interested in biology and astronomy, in addition to his many political, philosophical interests that he read about all the time. As a member of the House of Burgesses from 1769 to 1775, that was the Virginia colonial government, the Virginia legislature, his progressive priorities were already in view. He advocated at varying times for reforms in land ownership that would benefit those who weren't already a part of the wealthy planter class, and at the same time, he pushed for reforms that would create religious toleration and that would roll back slavery to some extent. Jefferson was an extremely adept political operator early in his career and throughout his public life. He became a great listener and honed his capacity to reach accommodations with friends and rivals on issues that he cared about. And being a good listener is work. Don't let anybody ever tell you differently. So the fact that he was able to cultivate that ability helped him to understand where some of his rivals in some cases were coming from and helped him to reach accommodation with them at times. Jefferson meaningfully participated in the Revolution from a very early stage. He authored a summary view of the rights of British America in 1774, which was intended to help guide Virginia representatives to the First Continental Congress as they met there and tried to figure out how to respond to what the British government had done with the Intolerable Acts. Jefferson was, of course, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, which, whatever you think of how he lived the ideals of the document, continues to be an inspiration to people all over the world for how societies and governments ought to work. He contributed to the organization and structure of the Confederation Congress that helped govern at least somewhat functionally during the Revolution and immediately after the Revolution was over until the Constitution was ratified. He showed good martial leadership at times as governor of Virginia, going after loyalists and those leading insurrection, as in the case of Josiah Phillips, somebody that he helped get out of the way, who was causing a lot of trouble during the Revolution in Virginia when things were pretty dicey there as the British had invaded in the late 1770s, early 1780s. Jefferson saw the need for central government after the Revolution during his time in the Articles of Confederation Congress and saw the danger of civil war and anarchy without a strong central government, even though he would later on profess to be very skeptical of a stronger central government. He did notice at the time he wrote about it that the system under the Articles wasn't working very well, and that some kind of change, a stronger form of government in some manner, probably needed to happen. In his Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson laid out a plan for the gradual emancipation of slaves and their settlement into the interior of the United States. He also authored and voted for the Land Ordinance of 1784, a bill that didn't pass, but did become the model of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which outlined the process for new states being added to the Union and banned slavery from the old Northwest Territory, what is now the Midwest, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, etc. As a diplomat to France, Jefferson worked hard to get favorable trade terms for American goods and to establish a solid relationship with France as a counter to Britain's influence in the Atlantic region. He also, Jefferson, stood consistently for freedom of religion and freedom of expression, as probably best evidenced by his Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, something that he wanted to be noted on his tombstone, that he was the author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty. That's how important his authorship of that document was to him. He published it in 1786, and that document helped to guarantee not just religious tolerance for Virginians, but religious liberty for them. And the difference is people with differing religious beliefs weren't just going to be tolerated. They weren't just going to be not prosecuted. But anyone with differing religious beliefs, they had to have the freedom to express them openly, not to have to hide them. There wouldn't be tests to serve in any sort of public capacity in Jefferson's ideal. You could have whatever beliefs you wanted to. That's what religious liberty meant versus religious tolerance. And Jefferson also pushed for the disestablishment of the now Episcopal Church, what had been the Church of England, the Anglican Church, in Virginia. He wanted there to be a clear separation between the government of Virginia and the Episcopal Church so that the taxpayers weren't supporting the Episcopal Church in some manner. Jefferson also helped to establish important precedents for international affairs as the first ever Secretary of State for the United States, and he helped guide many important decisions during Washington's presidency, which was especially important given that everything was so new and they were all just kind of figuring it out without a real roadmap for how things were supposed to work. Jefferson successfully prosecuted a war against the Barbary Pirates as president of the United States that protected American commercial shipping in the Mediterranean region when it was a very serious problem for many years before that. Jefferson also, of course, concluded the Louisiana Purchase as president, which was perhaps the greatest territorial extension by peaceful means in the history of the world. The Louisiana Purchase, of course, doubled the size of the United States and added almost unfathomably to American wealth and power right up into the present. Jefferson signed into law the bill that created the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in, I think it was 1802, maybe 1803, but he did that. Surprisingly, Jefferson significantly strengthened the executive branch, the presidency, as he was president, in addition to strengthening the government, the federal government in general during his presidency, in a way that was very meaningful for future presidents and members of Congress. The federal government was much more organized and had a clearer sense of its duties and its powers after Jefferson's presidency than it did before. To his great credit, Jefferson chose not to destroy everything the Federalists had accomplished prior to his presidency by exercising restraint and keeping in place much of the Hamiltonian financial plan that was so good for the country, even though he disagreed with a lot of it. I think maybe the most important precedent of Jefferson's presidency is that when a president comes in from a different party than the party that had been in power, Jefferson set the example of the new party, the new administration that's in charge doesn't just take a wrecking ball to everything. And most presidents have followed that precedent until kind of recently. It is also worth noting that it was Jefferson who signed into law the federal abolition of the slave trade, from international sources anyway. It said in the Constitution that the slave trade was to exist for only 20 years. After ratification, the Constitution was ratified in 1788, so it would have expired in 1808, according to what was in the Constitution. But Jefferson made sure to sign into law the abolition of the international slave trade. It didn't end slavery in any sense in the United States, but at least it did stop the importation of slaves from outside of the United States. And after Jefferson's presidency was over, he didn't stop serving the country. He is probably the individual most responsible for the founding of the University of Virginia and for keeping it neutral as far as religious affiliation was concerned. There was a time when several different religious denominations, the Congregationalists, the Episcopalians, and so forth, wanted to try to have an official association with the University of Virginia. Jefferson stopped them from doing that, and he made sure that the university would be this grand place that would enable common people who showed extraordinary ability to come in, be well educated in the manner of a traditional gentleman, and go out into the world and make the country a better place. So Jefferson deserves a lot of props for the University of Virginia. Now, on to my boy, Alexander Hamilton, the founding father who I think I probably most identify with, not just in terms of the way that he looked at the world, and although I am not nearly the talent that Alexander Hamilton was, I think that when I look at the founding fathers and I try to say, okay, which of these guys do I feel like I have the same kind of skills as, I think Hamilton is probably the guy that was talented to a much greater degree in some of the same ways that I am. And, by the way, a guy who had a lot of the same flaws that I have. Perhaps those things are why I sympathize with him a lot more than with Thomas Jefferson. I think that's definitely a piece of it. You tend to be a lot more sympathetic to someone who is like you, and especially someone who you know has the same shortcomings that you do. I'm not a professor of sociology or anything, but I've been around people enough to know that it's easy for those who have the same problems to commiserate. So there's probably a little something to that. Anyway, Hamilton, to start with, unlike Thomas Jefferson, unlike George Washington, unlike a lot of the founding fathers, arose from the humblest beginnings imaginable to become an educated, respected, and renowned leader of the United States. One of the single most important leaders in American history. I will argue that to my death. Hamilton was born out of wedlock. He was a bastard, is the technical term for that, of course. And there were a lot of his political opponents who did not let him forget that. He was the son of a mother who was disgraced by her former husband in the former husband's vicious campaign to exact revenge for their failed marriage. His father, Hamilton's father, was not meaningfully involved in his life at any point. And his mother died when he was 10. So by the time Hamilton is 10 years old, he is alone in the world, and he has got to make it basically on his own. I mean, he had a little help from extended family and from his brother to some degree, but not very much at all. He survived because he showed talent and intelligence to those that gave him a chance as a child, and he worked very hard to make the most of those opportunities. He didn't at all have it easy in the same way that a guy like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or Robert Morris did. Hamilton was known to be very charismatic and charming, someone who could make most anyone like him if he got the notion to do so. He was incredibly intelligent and pushed hard to catch up, if you will, to those of the same age trying to graduate from college in only 1 or 2 years. And to be clear, at the time, college was something that a very small number of teenage boys attended. And usually they graduated from undergraduate study about the same time that students today would finish high school. So if you went to college, it was a lot earlier. And I think most of you who are watching this, who have watched me for a while, probably already know it is a much, 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 much smaller percentage of the population than who goes to college now. Hamilton advocated for revolutionary ideals in pamphlets and public discussions as a very young man. And even though he was in New York City, which was a hotbed of loyalist or pro-British sentiment, that's who the loyalists were, he was not afraid to speak his mind. And even though he was pro-revolution and agreed with a lot of the people who wanted to break away from Britain pretty early on, that did not stop him from helping loyalists who found themselves in trouble. There's a very famous story of Hamilton's headmaster at King's College, now Columbia, when Hamilton was there, who was a loyalist and who caught the ire of some pro-revolutionary folks who basically wanted to lynch the guy, the headmaster. And Hamilton helped the guy escape. His name escapes me. He ended up going back to England and watching as the United States became independent from England. But without Hamilton's help, he might have been killed that night. Hamilton, of course, served in the Continental Army, and he rose very quickly in the ranks because of his intelligence and his ability to speak French. He became, of course, Washington's aide-de-camp and perhaps Washington's most important advisor during the war. Now, that's a little tough to say, but Hamilton is definitely in the discussion for Washington's most important advisors during the war. He mastered, did Hamilton, writing in Washington's voice and was irreplaceable in Washington's view for the many services that he provided to the general. He only left Washington's side because he wanted the opportunity to lead a force, and he finally got it in 1781 when he demonstrated great bravery in the charges he led at the Battle of Yorktown, the final great victory against the British in 1781 in Virginia. Hamilton had prepared to lead a force since he was at King's College. He became an excellent drill master, and people who watched him do his thing with his troops were all very impressed at the way he was able to discipline them and get them to march and get in formation and handle themselves like professionals. That's something that Hamilton prided himself on, was his ability to lead military men. Hamilton understood the vagaries of human behavior very well. He had a good instinct for what people were and how they were. And he also understood that the worst impulses of people could only be curtailed by sound and powerful government, something I very much happen to agree with. Even before the Revolutionary War was over, Hamilton was pushing for a stronger central government to correct the problems of the Articles of Confederation government, and Hamilton, was conferring with Robert Morris about creating a national bank as early as 1781. Ultimately, this exchange of letters that Hamilton had with Robert Morris about creating a central bank resulted in the institution of the Bank of North America, which opened in Philadelphia in January of 1782, and very much was a forerunner to the Bank of the United States, which I'll get to in a moment. Hamilton did not believe that democracy and republicanism were the panaceas to humanity's problems. In fact, he understood, did Hamilton, the shortcomings of popular rule and was always sensitive to what we now call the tyranny of the majority. This is perhaps best illustrated by his defense of loyalists' legal rights in New York after the Revolution, when many of the patriots, the pro-revolutionary crowd in New York, really wanted to hammer the loyalists for having sided with Great Britain. Hamilton was acknowledged as a fantastically talented lawyer who, despite the many criticisms he faced as a corrupt government official pursuing ill-gotten money, never cared much for money, as any evidence would show, and in fact was reputed to charge less than he could have for his services as a lawyer. After the Revolutionary War was over, he helped to rebuild a devastated New York City when the British occupation finally ended. Hamilton was a brilliant mind in many facets of study, but especially in terms of finance. As a lawyer in the Rutgers versus Waddington case of 1784 in New York, Hamilton defended both the concept of national law being superior to the state laws and the notion that courts would decide what the law means, or judicial review, well before the Constitutional Convention or the Federalist Papers put that idea of judicial review out into the public. One of the many Herculean tasks of work that Hamilton performed was that he single-handedly drafted the Constitution of the Bank of New York in 1784, the first bank in that city and the state. It helped New York develop into the banking center of the country, helped New York City recover from the Revolutionary War, and provided a model for later banks all over the United States. It was a big deal. He, Hamilton, was an ardent abolitionist who is part of multiple abolition societies, the New York Society for Promoting the Manumission of Slaves, for one example, and who consistently protested against the notion that black people were inferior to white people, even as he was surrounded by slave owners. His father-in-law, his sister-in-law, and many of those who he worked with in government were slave owners. But he never lost sight of that North Star, that slavery was wrong and that black people were legally and intellectually the equals of white people. Along with James Madison, Hamilton became one of the chief architects of the Annapolis Resolution at the Annapolis Convention that led directly to the Constitutional Convention a year later. In addition, Hamilton was one of the most important figures at the Constitutional Convention for setting the basic rules of engagement, and he was a staunch advocate for creating a stronger national government despite being sabotaged by the other members of the convention from New York who were put there by leading political figures in the state of New York that were nervous about the creation of a stronger central government and sought to effectively sabotage the Constitutional Convention from possibly creating a stronger central government that would undermine the power of New York. Hamilton had a vital role in getting the Constitution ratified in New York. Speaking of the Constitution and New York, during the convention there, he explained the meaning of the Constitution while endorsing its accomplishments in the Federalist Papers, which he wrote a majority of with Madison and John Jay. He wrote, I think, 51 of the, I think it was 85 of them altogether. During his time as Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton wrote a number of detailed plans that led directly to the creation of the Bank of the United States, to the assumption of all state and national debt. He also wrote a plan that detailed a system of taxes and payments to help get the country out of debt. He created a scheme for standardizing currency, and he wrote a report that outlined a vision for the establishment of manufacturing and industry in the United States, which was way ahead of its time. And had it been embraced, the United States might have industrialized a lot earlier than it did. Hamilton also created an amazingly effective financial plan as Secretary of the Treasury that both helped to establish the sound credit and financial stability of the United States and functioned to bind the states together with the central government and each other, at a time when a powerful central government was a pretty controversial idea and the states had very little attachment to one another. In part, to help his financial plan work, Hamilton created the precursor to the Coast Guard as a means of collecting the revenue from tariffs imposed by his financial system. Tariffs would be the primary way that Hamilton would collect revenue for the federal government. There were other things too, but the tariffs were the main thing. Speaking of other methods of collecting federal revenue, Hamilton personally led the military force out to Pennsylvania that would put down the Whiskey Rebellion, which was an uprising organized to protest the excise tax that was a part of Hamilton's revenue scheme. Hamilton was, in fact, the one who pushed George Washington the hardest to exercise executive authority and send the message to individuals in the country and to the states that the national government was serious and not to be trifled with. They were never really implemented, but Hamilton did advocate for vast infrastructure projects that would be taken on by later administrations and Congresses. So they weren't implemented during his lifetime, but they became inspirational for later American leaders who would create a lot of national infrastructure to help bind the country together, to make the economy run more smoothly, and so forth. There's pretty much no doubt that Hamilton was Washington's most important advisor during Washington's presidency, and he even operated, as Chernow puts it, as something of a prime minister to Washington's monarch. That's the comparison that is made not just by Chernow, but by a number of other historians. Despite repeated accusations, Hamilton, never did a thing to enrich himself as Treasury Secretary, even in the face of how easy it would have been for him to do so, and even though he faced very real financial difficulties as a public servant. Anybody who served in the government in the 1790s, early 1800s, was almost certainly giving up a more lucrative opportunity to do something else. And there's a really big disparity at this time between what one could earn as a public servant and what one could earn as, for instance, a lawyer in New York City. Hamilton gave up a lot of potential money so that he could lead the country and help to build up the United States in those early days. He was accused all the time of schemes that would line his own pockets, that would help enrich British investors, and all kinds of crazy shit. But he refuted those accusations over and over and over again successfully. As Ron Chernow put it in his biography of Hamilton, quote, "If Washington was the father of the country and Madison the father of the Constitution, then Alexander Hamilton was surely the father of the American government." Pretty high praise, I think, and totally justified in my mind. Okay, on to the more negative stuff. I've already said that I am more sympathetic generally to Hamilton than to Jefferson, because I see the world and humanity and society a lot more like Hamilton did than like Jefferson did. But it's not just that. It's also because Jefferson did a lot of things and behaved in a lot of ways that I find really objectionable. There are things that he did as a politician, as a leader, that I just can't get past. And it's hard for me, now that I know a lot more about who he was as a leader, as a politician, as a founding father, to think of him as just this romantic philosopher who wanted the best for the common man. It's just not the guy I see, and here's why. I think Jefferson's life of privilege may have warped his view of people and how society worked. He had an absurdly, in my view, Pollyannish outlook on human nature and average people. And what that has to do with his upbringing is that I think he was so surrounded by other wealthy, privileged people that he romanticized average, common people rather than actually getting to know them and seeing the desperate circumstances that they could often be in, and just being around a greater variety of people. I think that when you surround yourself with one class of person, with one type of individual who's very interested in the same things that you are, and Jefferson very definitely was surrounded by a pretty homogenous group of people, I think it distorts your perspective on how people actually are. And I think that Hamilton, on the other hand, had a much more rough and tumble upbringing and was surrounded by a lot more different kinds of people. And that's why he, Hamilton, understood the way that people could be shitty. And Jefferson didn't. That's my theory. I don't know whether it's accurate or not, but it makes sense to me, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's something to it. Apart from his Pollyannish view on average people, Jefferson did a number of things that were pretty questionable in terms of his romantic life, and this is the first of them. He tried to creep on his buddy, allegedly his buddy, John Walker's wife, as a young man in the 1760s. Normally, I don't judge people in romantic relationships, but creeping on your buddy's wife, that's just not something I could ever justify. I mean, the heart wants what it wants, and all is fair in love and war and so forth, and I tend to be a lot more forgiving about people's behavior in romantic relationships. They're complicated. People do crazy shit because of love or lust or whatever, but that's a thing that I could never envision doing myself, is creeping on a buddy's wife. Jefferson believed that republicanism would solve all of society's ills. For instance, he thought that if all countries were republics, war would vanish. He wrote that in many instances and communicated that to lots of people. I mean, that's just like childish. I'm sorry. And obviously proven incorrect by the many instances in which modern republics have gone to war with each other. Apart from his general view on human nature, Jefferson never seemed to accept blame for mistakes. And that is directly related to the very next point I would make, which is that he, Jefferson, was utterly terrified of any sort of confrontation. He avoided disagreeing with people in person like some people avoid hospitals. He was allergic to it. And that, to me, is not the quality or characteristic I want in a leader. I want a leader who's willing to hear from people he doesn't agree with, and to have sometimes ugly arguments over things, because that is the nature of leadership. It's one of the pieces of it, in my mind, is that you have to be willing to stand up for what you believe in the face of people who disagree with you. And Jefferson just was not capable of that, at least in part because he could not stand criticism. He was very, very sensitive. In addition, Jefferson flipped around on his principles all the time. I mean, he says all men are created equal, and he deplored parties and factions, even as he became a de facto leader of the burgeoning Democratic Republican Party, and he said he was a strict constructionist right up until he became president, and the power of the executive branch was in his hands, and he did Louisiana Purchase, and he really cracked down hard on the embargo, using federal power in a way that it would be impossible for me to imagine him endorsing another person doing. If he saw somebody else cracking down on violators of the embargo the way that he did, I'm sure he would have had a shit fit. Upon learning that some of the Cherokees had allied with Britain, Jefferson said, and I quote, "Nothing will reduce those wretches so soon as pushing the war into the heart of their country. But I would not stop there. I would never cease pursuing them while one of them remained on this side of the Mississippi." And that, I think, gives you a preview for what he would do as president with Native Americans. He did not think that Native Americans belonged in his calculations for the future of the United States. I said earlier that he showed some martial leadership as governor of Virginia. Well, that was very much overshadowed by the lack of leadership he showed as governor of Virginia. He failed to act on intelligence of a British invasion until it was too late. The British invaded Virginia while Jefferson was governor, and he did not lead state officials, the militia, or common people to rally around him to resist the invaders. He just took off. And then he accepted the end of his term and walked away in the midst of the crisis. And that's something that followed him around for the rest of his political career. And whenever it got brought up, he was mortified to talk about it. It was something he was ashamed of for the rest of his life. Justifiably so, I think. Remember how I said that Jefferson pushed for abolition when he was a member of the House of Burgesses, and how he pushed for it again with the Land Ordinance of 1784? Well, he forgot about that pretty quickly. He gave up on pushing for abolition in the 1780s, as it was a political loser in his view. So as soon as it became inconvenient politically, he kind of just forgot about it. He was obsessed to the point of paranoia with the idea that there were monarchists everywhere in the United States, especially among his opponents in the Federalist Party. He thought everyone in the Federalist Party wanted to be Great Britain 2.0, and they all wanted a king and not the Republican government that had been established by the Constitution. He saw Britain as the font of all evil, and tailored much of his politics around the notion that the Revolution and America's struggle against Britain was not over with the end of the Revolutionary War. At the same time, he was almost comically apologist about the violence and extremism of the French Revolution. Here's a direct quote: "The liberty of the whole earth was depending on the issue of the contest. Rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and Eve left in every continent and left free, it would be better than it is now." Unquote. That's the talk of a revolutionary maniac. Somebody who is saying that, yeah, the whole populations of the earth should be desolated in the interest of making the political scene what I would like it to be. I mean, that's how revolutions end up with massacres. Jefferson urged his client, sycophant, whatever you want to call him, Freneau, the author of one of these partisan newspapers that existed in the 1790s, and Madison, his best friend and political life partner, and others to attack Hamilton, Washington, and the Federalists as monocrats, monarchists, enemies of the people, and republic, while refusing to ever get his own hands dirty or confront anyone ever. To Madison, this is a direct quote: "For God's sake, my dear sir, take up your pen, select the most striking heresies, and cut him to pieces in the face of the public." Unquote. He's talking about Hamilton in that instance. He just never wanted to get his hands dirty, which again really doesn't sit well with me. It's like if you disagree with somebody, part of being a leader is for you to take that case to the person or the people that you disagree with and reach a compromise or convince them that your way of thinking or your approach is the right way to do things. And Jefferson just never did that kind of shit. He'd rather pay somebody to attack one of his opponents than even do it himself. Jefferson paid James Callender to defame the Federalists and his friend, allegedly, John Adams, and then denied that he did it when publicly exposed by Callender, who had to prove it with Jefferson's letters to Callender. So Jefferson said, "Oh, I never did that shit." And then Callender's like, "Here's the receipts, buddy. You did that shit." Also, he didn't own up to these things when he was personally confronted with them by Abigail Adams. I mean, this is after he's president, and she comes to him as a friend. Jefferson, John Adams, and Abigail Adams had all been very friendly when they were together in Paris, and she came to him and said, "Why did you disrespect my husband, basically? Why did you trash him in that way when he was supposed to be your friend?" And he just said, "I didn't do that." That's some bitch-made behavior, I'm sorry. Jefferson also played a major role in Indian removal by buying up as much Indian land in the Louisiana Territory as possible, as well as purchasing lands east of the Mississippi. He never gave any serious thought to trying to help Native Americans keep their lands and culture, and he consistently described them as an obstacle to white yeoman farmers. This is a good example of where Jefferson's rhetoric about all men being created equal and believing in liberty and that the United States is this great hope for all the world's people proves to be bullshit. And what he really wanted was a nation of white farmers. That's who he cared about. Jefferson, in fact, demonstrated his lack of consistency in principle with numerous instances in which he extended executive authority. He said he believed in limited government. He said he was scared of the national government, of too much authority in the central government. But when he did the Louisiana Purchase, when he did the Embargo Act, when he fought the Barbary Pirates, and other examples, he seemed to be fine with executive authority when he was wielding it. But the Federalists were, of course, all aspiring monocrats and monarchists. Give me a fucking break. Jefferson foolishly overestimated the importance of both commerce and trade in general for international peace, and the power and influence of American commerce and trade in particular, and the leverage that we, the United States, had over other countries, especially Britain. It's why the embargo failed so spectacularly. He also totally undermined his ideas of limited government with the Embargo Act, particularly in how stringently he applied force to making sure that people abided by it as his presidency drew to a close. I also read recently that he was basically on cruise control for the last 3-4 months of his presidency. He let go of the rope as president in the final months, left Madison kind of like flailing, not knowing exactly what to do, as a serious crisis was unfolding. The embargo hadn't worked. Congress was really unhappy. People in New England and New York were really unhappy. And Jefferson was like, okay, well, I guess I'll just walk away now. And that's how that ended. Madison had to kind of pick up the pieces. Now, maybe you could make the argument that he didn't want to get in Madison's way, and he wanted to allow his good friend and now president to kind of do his own thing, but Jefferson could have at least provided him some guidance and helped Madison communicate with what at the time was a very fractious Congress. He didn't do that. And here are the things that I really can't stomach. I mean, I have a real big problem with Jefferson's hypocrisy in terms of his principles. I have a real big problem with his lack of leadership and what a cowardly little pussy he could be in terms of trying to confront people that disagreed with him or accept responsibility for when he fucked up. But this shit is what I can't get past. He was engaging all the time, late in his life, in scientific racism, claiming eventually that people of African ancestry were inferior to white people, in part at least to justify slavery, which he had totally abandoned as a cause he was trying to fight against. He sought to have all African Americans relocated to other parts of the world because he never believed that they and white Americans could peacefully coexist. He convinced himself of that, and there was nothing that anybody could do to make him think we could all get along. Jefferson had what could not possibly be described as a fully consensual sexual relationship with Sally Hemings, starting when she was 15, maybe 16. The timeline's a little unsure, but at the oldest, she was 16. He coaxed her to return to the United States after he started having sex with her, and to slavery, by the way. She would have been free in France. He did this by promising that each of her children would be free when they turned 21. Now, if that doesn't gross you out, and this is one of those things where, like, I don't care about the values of the time. I am willing to give people a certain amount of leeway, but there were plenty of Americans at this time and other people in other parts of the world who recognized that slavery was wrong and that certainly the sexual exploitation of slaves was really wrong. Finally, he did not free Sally or any of his other slaves, apart from his and Sally's children, when he died. He sold them off to pay his massive debts, which were mostly the result of his spendthrift lifestyle. He could not stop buying ridiculous luxury bullshit. And yes, he did take on some debt of one of his friends, and yes, there were other dynamics at play for why he was in debt, but if he had just cut out all of his ridiculous spending, he could have set those people free, as George Washington did when George Washington died. But he didn't do that. So for all of his rhetoric about all men are created equal, about caring for the humanity of all people, and so forth, he didn't live up to it. And I am one of those very much actions speak louder than words kind of people. Okay, last but not least, I have to be honest about the real shortcomings of my man Hamilton here, because he did have them, and they did hurt his political career, among other things. Hamilton had a serious ego problem and a big chip on his shoulder that he was never really able to get over. I mention them together because they are interrelated. The fact that he had a chip on his shoulder is one of the things that gave him kind of an ego problem, and it was something that caused him problems throughout his professional life. He was, in my opinion, a little too enamored with Great Britain. He saw all of the good with Great Britain, and as much as he was a patriot and pro-revolutionary, he wanted to emulate Britain a little too much, I think. I think he would have been better to realize that what the United States was trying to become was something fundamentally different and hopefully better than what Britain had been for most of his life. He could never let any slight go, and he always felt the need to vociferously defend himself and attack anyone who attacked him. That's a shortcoming I understand, because I have a hard time when somebody's coming at me letting it go. I really should, and I understand that, where that comes from, because you care about your reputation a lot. He did, I do, and you want to defend yourself when somebody's coming at you in a way that you feel is unfair. And he certainly did get a lot of what I would call unfair criticism, but there were times where he could have and probably should have just let it go, and he just never was able to do that. I said he was charismatic and charming, and he was, but people either loved or hated him, and he was not good at winning over those that didn't necessarily like him and that he needed in order to accomplish some of the things that he wanted to accomplish. When he didn't like somebody, he wasn't one to sugarcoat it or to try to be false in his view with them and make them think that he did like them or that he was willing to respect them or get along with them. And that is not a great characteristic in an effective politician. Effective politicians have to be people that can push past personal problems and work together with people they disagree with and even dislike in order to get things done. In that same vein, Hamilton was often incapable of accepting anything less than everything he wanted. This is really damaging for someone in politics too, because sometimes you have to accept half a loaf. You have to understand that you're not going to get everything you want, and there were instances where he could get a lot of what he wanted, but he was so focused on the things that he wasn't going to get, whether it was with the Bank of the U.S. or with his financial program or with some piece of policy that the Washington administration was going to pursue or whatever, that he wasn't going to get all of. He could not let go of the thing that he wasn't going to get. And that's just, again, not a trait of an effective politician. He was pretty snobbish and elitist, and he didn't have a lot of time or patience for common folks or for anyone who wasn't as smart as he was. Again, that's something I understand. Not the whole common thing. I don't look down my nose at people, but honestly, when I'm talking to somebody and they're saying something that I think is dumb and I know it's wrong, I have a hard time being patient in that circumstance. And it's not a great characteristic that I see in myself. And it's something that I constantly need to work on. I got to be more patient with people when I disagree with them, even if I know that they're saying stuff that's wrong, factually inaccurate, whatever. And that's something that Hamilton was not good about, was being gracious to people who weren't as smart as he was. Hamilton was also a little too fond of scheming politically to get what he wanted or what he thought was best for the country. He actually kind of enjoyed the schemes, the plotting against people that he disagreed with. That's not something that I'm like. I had that instinct. I don't have that instinct at all, trying to scheme to destroy people. But that's something that Hamilton very much had, and something that isn't great when you read about his personality. It's not sort of what you want in somebody that you respect. At least I don't. One of Hamilton's biggest shortcomings is that he just suffered from very poor judgment at times. He caused a lot of self-inflicted wounds, and these are things that could have been avoided if he'd been more patient or less stubborn. And this is kind of related to the other stuff I've said already. It's why when Washington wasn't there to kind of act as his guardian angel, he did some pretty stupid shit. And had it not been for the guidance of Washington in many instances, Hamilton might have done a lot more stupid shit. It was impossible to convince him he was wrong when he believed he was right about something. I can very much identify with that. That's a big problem of mine. And again, not a terribly attractive quality, I know. Hamilton betrayed his wife, who seems to have been nothing but awesome. And then he compounded the mistake by carrying on the affair for a long time with a woman who was clearly a manipulative shakedown artist, exceeded only in that department by her husband, who was even more of a manipulative shakedown artist. And again, I am disinclined to judge people for their romantic proclivities or foibles, because that stuff is complicated. Relationships are complicated, and people do things in relationships a lot of times that they don't even understand as they're doing them. But it's pretty hard to be very sympathetic or defensive of Hamilton when I'm thinking about his affair with, what's her name? Maria Reynolds. It's hard to look at what he did and try to defend it. His public admission to the affair was also a gross political miscalculation and had to have been devastating for his poor wife, Eliza. She had to be publicly humiliated like that. And as much as Hamilton was more concerned about trying to defend himself against accusations of impropriety as Secretary of the Treasury, he had this notion in his head that copping to the affair in a lot of detail was somehow gonna get him completely out of trouble with the other stuff, with the financial impropriety accusations. And to some extent it did, but admitting to the affair was pretty devastating for Hamilton's political career. I think it's hard to argue in hindsight that it was a good idea. Hamilton let his ambition and desire to push the country in a particular direction allow him to undercut his fellow Federalists and even sabotage them at times. He tried to undercut John Adams, for example, on many occasions while Adams was president. He didn't just try, he succeeded. He had a lot of Adams' cabinet members in his pocket, so to speak. The problems really started between Hamilton and Adams with the election of 1796, where Hamilton tried to push for Charles Cotesworth Pinckney to be president and not John Adams, mostly because Hamilton was concerned about Thomas Jefferson winning votes away and somehow becoming president. It wasn't a wise political move, and it just made him that much more of a puppet master during Adams's presidency in a way that really undermined Adams and caused their relationship to be totally poisonous by the time Adams' presidency was over. To my mind, the single biggest black mark against Alexander Hamilton, at least in his political life, was that he tried to have John Jay, who at the time was governor of New York. John Jay, if you remember, was the first Supreme Court Chief Justice and also the author of at least a handful of the Federalist Papers. He was governor of New York in the late early 1800s, and after the Democratic Republicans won the state's elections in 1800, Hamilton tried to have John Jay change the state's elections after the fact. So the elections happened, the Democratic Republicans won in no small part due to Aaron Burr's politicking. And after that happened, and it became apparent because of that Thomas Jefferson was going to win the presidency, Alexander Hamilton tried to have John Jay invalidate those elections, which is as gross a violation of the rule of law and of the constitutional order as you can imagine. So that is utterly indefensible in my mind. Hamilton tried to justify it by saying, well, these are not normal times and Jefferson as president would be an utter disaster and on, but it just undermined everything the constitutional order and the founding fathers had tried to establish. And I can't find any way to say that was anything other than just a terrible move and instinct on Hamilton's part. Hamilton did eventually utterly betray John Adams while Adams was president with the letter from Alexander Hamilton concerning the public conduct and character of John Adams, Esquire, President of the United States. It was eventually a pamphlet. At first, it was just letters. Some Democratic Republican got a hold of it and started to publish pieces of it in Democratic Republican newspapers and partisan newspapers. And so he eventually, Hamilton, published the entire thing, and it talked about Adams's great intrinsic defects, which in Hamilton's view made Adams unfit for the office of chief magistrate. And look, there's something to this. There were a lot of Federalists that were very concerned about Adams' temperament and about his ability to handle the job, but this is not what you do to a colleague, is attack them out in the open like this in a way that is really disrespectful. And it probably did a lot of damage to the Federalists at a time when they were still pretty strong, and they might have won the election of 1800 without something like this. There's a lot of reasonable evidence to suggest that. So not a great move for Hamilton's legacy there. Despite being an immigrant himself and having a lot of people attack him for his status as an immigrant, Hamilton took to demonizing other immigrants late in his life when they began to associate themselves disproportionately with the Democratic Republican Party. He was clearly angry that they strengthened his enemies, and he kind of forgot himself and forgot that he himself was an immigrant and how it made him feel when other people attacked his status as an immigrant. And he just went to town on a lot of these people in a way that is really disappointing when you read what he did. He got involved in way too many dueling incidents because he felt absurdly compelled to defend his honor anytime someone criticized him. I said already that he was way too sensitive about perceived slights, and at least like half a dozen times, he walked right up to the precipice of a duel, which dueling in general, most people thought was pretty stupid at this time, and it's hard to think it's justifiable now. Speaking of dueling, the Aaron Burr duel was both ludicrous and irresponsible. He allowed it to escalate far beyond where it should have after his own son had died in a duel just a couple of years before, and he and his wife were devastated. The lack of self-awareness there is really upsetting in someone that I have a lot of respect for. That he allowed this situation to escalate way beyond where it needed to, despite attempts at mediation. All he had to do really was ignore it, and there are ways he could have approached it that would have squashed the whole thing, but he didn't do that. He did what he had been accustomed to doing, which was to approach it as this position of honor, and I have to do it, and I've got to defend myself, and I'm not going to let this Burr character defame me, and so forth. But it wasn't necessary. And given the circumstances, I just think it's unforgivable that he allowed the duel to take place. And then, of course, finally, he marched into very possible death in the duel. Of course, he did die with Burr, even though he had a wife and many children to support. And he foolishly, stupidly convinced himself that they would be all right financially when he should have known better. And it was all for just stupid pride. I mean, they weren't destitute, fortunately, because a lot of Hamilton's compatriots came to help him, but he had sort of talked himself into the idea that because her father, Philip Schuyler, was well off, that she and his children, he had like 7 or 8 of them, would be okay. And first of all, any of you that have children of your own know that you don't put them in a position to be without you, even if financially they would be okay. You don't deprive them of their father or mother. If it's at all possible, you avoid that. That's just parenting 101, obviously, right? And that he still marched into what could have been death because of his stupid pride. I mean, I just can't get past it. And it's one of these things where you see that his ego really got the better of him. And it's a damn shame because his family and certainly the country could have used his help in the years after he died. He was killed in the duel. He died a couple days later after being mortally wounded. So that's it. So yeah, Jefferson and Hamilton, there's a reason that they both deserve their place in history. They deserve their flowers. They did a lot for the country. But for reasons I've explained now pretty thoroughly, you can see why I sympathize a lot more with Hamilton's point of view and why I have a lot more respect for him and what he did, what he accomplished, than I do for Jefferson. And a lot of it does have to do with the fact that I just can't get over some of Jefferson's very, very, very problematic character deficiencies and the way that he behaved. So thanks very much, as always, for listening. I hope you found this entertaining, perhaps a little long, but I thought it was an interesting thing to do. Anyway, please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. Really helps people find the channel, helps me to keep doing this. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you'll like and subscribe. I hope you'll spread the word if you are so inclined. And I hope you'll be back here next time when I have an episode that is a little more like the ones I traditionally do. Take care, and I will see you then.